Libya, in many ways, has become violent because of the tribalism, because Gaddafi has done what people like Saddam Hussein or Assad have done, which is to use the divisions within society to play them off against each other and make military units that are based on one tribe or another tribe and then compete. And that's why half the country is disaffected, Cyrenaica, and the areas around Tripoli and so forth have stayed, or we'll see how long they stay loyal. But he's been able to divide and get some people to kill the other people. In Egypt and Tunisia, you didn't have that. Homogeneous societies, nations that had really taken root in many ways. The military could say, we're not going to fight against our dictator. We're not going to fight against our people. And we're going to abandon the dictator. Because they knew, or at least they have a good chance of all being rehired by whoever comes next. Maybe the top 20, but even the top 20 are gambling that they're going to be rehired. And they might. We don't know yet. That's good odds. Who would stick by your dictator if he becomes embarrassing and you can just dump him and then you get rehired? And that's the situation in Tunisia and in Egypt. It will not be the situation, clearly, in Libya. The people who have shot their own people are going to stick by Gaddafi because it's too late for them now. In places like Syria, the Alawite military elite are in bed with the president. If they get overturned, Sunnis are going to take power and they're all going to get fired. They're not going to be rehired by whatever new president comes along. So they have a lot at stake if they fall. And this is where civil war comes in and all the feuds. So there's a lot of differences between these different countries, is guess what I'm saying, and how they will respond to these same stimuli. And I think that we're seeing this wave is going to hit, this wave of democratization is going to hit a barrier fairly soon, because they're going to run up against countries that are deeply divided, where things become much more violent than they were in places like Egypt and Tunisia. But on that note, I hope I've laid out some of the complexities. The media is clearly very important. It's what's new. The economics is also new to a certain extent. This incredible run-up in commodity prices. Wheat and sugar both have gone up 100% in the last 2 years in prices, like gold or silver, these other commodities. And then finally, the lack of politics. Everybody was sort of gone to sleep and thought the Middle East is not ready for democracy, because they looked at Iraq, they looked at Syria. But that's very different. Egypt, Tunisia are very different. Much more homogeneous, obviously nation states that have taken to a certain degree. Egyptians really astounded us in how polite they were, how cohesive. Groups from the Muslim Brotherhood to the secular youth worked together and were polite to each other. When Mubarak tried to bring down the revolution by beating them up and getting people to fight each other and causing havoc that he thought would then create a call for the military to step back in, they didn't bite. They didn't take the bait. They said, no, we're not going to fight back. And they stood firm. That's unusual. That's a new thing in the Middle East. It takes an extraordinary level of cohesiveness and cooperation amongst all the elements in Egyptian society. That's new. So that is a harbinger of the new things, this sort of a nation state that's solid. And on that note, I will come to the end, and thank you very much.
Do we have time to hear some questions?
Do we? How long have I talked for? I've talked for about half an hour. Okay.
Good.
Yes.
It will be really good.
Let's take questions about 10 minutes. Yes.
I'm really interested in the relationship between media and secularization, because there was one historical way of arguing that essentially, the democratic power of literacy, reading, writing, very powerful. When it came to electronic media, it seemed to have less of an impact in terms of spreading democratization. Now it seems to have gone back in the internet to what print, reading, and writing did, which was kind of a pervasive rise in literacy, and along with that kind of a rise in secularization. Is that a good way to think about it, or is that...
Secularization. This is of course, one of the most contested contested points in the Middle East, because everybody is asking, who's going to take over? Is it going to be the Muslim Brotherhood? And America is clearly terrified. Israel is terrified that Islamists will come to power. They're all trying to figure out, who are the Muslim Brotherhood? Have they changed from 30 years ago? What do they believe? Have secular forces become pervasive? And we saw in Iraq, President Bush was gambling on a secular middle class to take over and not be pro-Iranian, to be anti-Iranian and pro-American. It didn't happen that way. All the parties that emerged that had any real guts to them were religious parties, both on the Shiite and the Sunni side of things. There weren't secular parties. There Alawi, who was a Sunni running for Shiite votes in the Ba'athist vote, but he was shut out. Now, he got the biggest vote, but they made a deal with him, but he basically has no power. And it's the Shiite parties that are running the show, and they're religious. So there's a cautionary tale in there. I don't think they will ultimately be, want to be like Iran, but the Middle East is caught. Everybody wants to compare the Middle East to Enlightenment Europe. And Europe went through 200 years or more of destroying the church. And my students, I always have the hardest time teaching this, because my students all assume that Christianity was created leaving to Caesar what is Caesar's and having a separation of church and state, and that it's the natural thing in Western society. And that there didn't have to be any violence in order to get the separation of church and state. Of course, that's not true. We know the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War, destroying the church in France, in the French Revolution, stealing all their land. Henry VIII did the same thing in England, stole all the land, and then forced the priests to all kiss each of their hands. And this was a long, brutal process, civil wars. The Middle East has been undergoing something like that, but in a much shorter period of time. Turkey is an example of way out ahead, because Ataturk did destroy the religious establishment. But he only did it for about 50 years. He got rid of all the schools, he created secular courts, secular judges, secular military, secular everything. And he tried to outlaw anything that was religious. But it's coming back very quickly now that the military has been pushed aside and there's an Islamic party ruled. How much? The West all thinks, well, Turkey's going to be secular because they've gotten so rich, they're middle class, they're over, they're now at $10,000, $11,000 per capita income, or it's maybe $8,000, $9,000, but still that's above what political scientists always think, like $6,000 is the tipping point towards democracy. Because it means education, it means infrastructure, it means jobs, it means industrialization. These income things mean a lot of development, which makes you sort of follow a Western model. So nobody's worried about the Islamic Party in Turkey, because they figure, oh, these guys are all fat industrialists and they're making TVs for Europe and they're safe. Even if they come a little bit back to Islam, they're not going to go very far. But you don't know in the Middle East, because you don't have that history in the Arab world of destroying the religious establishment. Lots of countries have tried to destroy it. They've done it half-heartedly and they haven't been legitimate enough to really destroy it. And the institutions are still strong. The major opposition parties in every Middle Eastern country are really the Muslim Brotherhood. And some of them are still quite radical, or at least they're divided. They're taking on a much more democratic line. And that's the case with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Syria. They all say democracy. We're part of the national dialogue. We don't want to rule. We're going to rule with other people like all other parties. That's changed. 20 years ago, they didn't say that. Today, they do say that. Now, most of my Christian friends in Syria and so forth wouldn't trust a Muslim brother as far as they could throw. They say, oh, they just say that, but they don't mean it. Of course, they don't know. And one of the things we learned in Egypt was the Muslim Brotherhood hung back. They didn't want to get out front because they know that they need this big coalition of Egyptians in order to get rid of the Mubarak regime. And that's important, because even if you're not a convinced Democrat, you can have, the political science talk about democracy without Democrats. That if people understand that they have to cooperate in order to get what they want, they will cooperate. And that can restrain non-democratic instincts. So maybe we're at some kind of tipping point like that. I don't know. We don't know what we're going to find, because free political life is not flourished. And I think there's going to be a sorting out. A lot of political scientists say, well, based on studies, Islamist parties will only win 20 to 30, 35% in a real vote. But you don't know. Hamas won Palestine in the elections. Of course, Palestine is a very extreme example because they're a brutalized society, so you get extreme results. But we don't know. So where we are in secularization, which is your question in the Middle East, is a very complex question, and we don't really know. I think the Middle East is in the midst of a sort of enlightenment process. How deep it goes in society, I can't really say. I think the elites are quite, have sort of left religion as the main truth in their life. Many of them have, not all of them. But many people do see God as providing the big T, the truth that can be used in politics and every other aspect of life. They're not willing to have sort of two truths, a public truth, which has little t, and a private truth, which is a big T, and then everybody else is a kafir of the unbelievers. You can walk out of your house and say, oh, that person living next door, the Muslim living next door is going to go to hell, too bad for him, or something like that. But we don't carry that into public life. You could think that in your church, but you can't think it in public life. You can't say, oh, the Muslims are going to go to hell. If you do, you'll lose elections here, and you'll be written, it's against the law to discriminate against them based on those things. In the Middle East, it's still, many places you can say things like that. And in the textbooks, the classroom textbooks on Islam say things like, the more educated Muslims should be leaving the country. In Syria, there's a direct implication in the Islamic textbooks that Muslims should be ruling the country. They don't say it in those words, but they say you should know fiqh and you should know things because that's what God, that's the truth. So those things are still there in society. That's a long answer to your question. And we don't really know what we're going to find. Press can be leading to it, but it can also lead to more Islam. Because people are spreading their religion and reading more religion. You look at Saint Qutb and the radical Muslims. The press has helped those people. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and throughout the Middle East spread because of the press, because they were educated and they figured out how to use. I don't know if they're using Twitter, but I'm sure they will.